She is counting the flour. Not scooping it, not measuring it, counting it. The way you count something when you are trying to make a number come out different than it is. Tin canister, both hands, the lamp behind her on the shelf throwing her shadow long across the kitchen floor. Outside, the wind is doing something it only does in January in Montana. Not howling, not dramatic, just pressing, steady, absolute. The kind of wind that makes the walls of a ranch house feel like an argument instead of a shelter. She lifts the canister lid. She looks. She puts the lid back. She does not say anything because there is no one to say anything to. The hired men are in the bunkhouse. The rancher is in town. The cattle are in the low pasture, and what the cattle are doing is no longer her problem to manage. She is the cook. She knows how much flour she has. She also knows something else, something she has been knowing, quietly, since the sky changed color this afternoon, since the temperature dropped 11 degrees in 40 minutes, since the horses in the near corral turned their backs to the north and stood there, pressed together, not moving. She goes to the window. The first flakes are coming sideways. This is not going to be an ordinary storm. The Alderman Ranch sat in the Boulder Creek Valley, Meagher County, Montana, and had been there since 1873, 14 years. Thomas Alderman had built it from a government land claim and 40 head of longhorn cattle that had not been suited to Montana winters and had mostly proved it by dying in the first one. He had rebuilt from that, which was the kind of thing that either made a man or finished him, and it had made Thomas Alderman into something specific, a man who was very good at the work and very poor at the things that were not work, and who had built an operation worth 2,000 acres and 160 head around those two facts. He had 5 hired men. 2 were reliable. 2 were willing. One was Pete Hallett, who was 71 years old and who had been with the ranch since 1875 and who had lost 3 fingers on his left hand to a rope in 1879 and whose value now was what he knew rather than what he could do. And he had a cook. Her name was Nora Greer. She had come to the Boulder Creek Valley in the spring of 1886, 9 months ago, after her husband Daniel died of a horse accident outside of Billings and left her with $11, a wagon, and a very clear understanding of her own capabilities. She was 34 years old. She had cooked in 2 mining camps, 1 hotel, and a cattle drive from Texas to Abilene before she was 25, and she had forgotten more about the way weather moved through this part of the country than most men on the Alderman spread had ever known. Nobody at the Alderman Ranch knew this last thing. They knew she made excellent biscuits. They knew she was quiet. They knew she kept the kitchen organized in a way that seemed fussy until you needed something at midnight and found it in the dark without looking. They did not know what she knew about blizzards. They were about to find out. Honam, Thomas Alderman, had ridden to town that morning. Boulder Creek, 8 miles. He had gone for feed supply receipts and a conversation with the bank that he had been postponing since October and that could not be postponed any further. He had expected to be back by 2. It was now 4:30. The temperature was dropping at a rate Nora had felt only twice before in her life. Once in Wyoming in 1878, once on the cattle drive, somewhere in the Indian Territory, when 3 men had made the mistake of not listening to the trail cook's instructions and had not been found until March. She went to the bunkhouse. She knocked, not the way you knock when you want to come in, the way you knock when you need someone to understand that you are not asking. A voice said, "Yeah." She said, "I need all of you in the main house." Silence. A different voice. Frank Mears, who was 26 and who had been with the ranch 8 months and who was not yet 30 but already had the opinion of an older man regarding people who told him what to do, said, "What for?" Nora said, "Because in about 4 hours it's going to be 30 below and the bunkhouse stove won't hold it. And because the cattle need to be moved before it gets dark and there are only 3 hours of light left." Another silence. Longer. Pete Hallett's voice. Slower. The voice of a man who has been alive long enough to recognize a thing that knows what it's talking about. He said, "How bad?" Nora said, "Bad enough that I'm standing here instead of in the kitchen." Pete said, "Boys." They came out. Wanted. She did not give orders. She said what needed doing and in what order and why, Briefly, the way you explain things when time is the actual problem and not the people. The cattle first. The two reliable men, Joe Birch and Calvin Pratt, knew the low pasture well enough to get there and back in the dark if it came to that. She told them the south draw was the wrong place to shelter the herd. She told them the canyon east of the dry creek had a natural windbreak and floor-level snowmelt from the cliff face that would keep it 3 degrees warmer than anywhere else on the property. She told them this without preamble, in the same voice she used when she explained where she kept the coffee. Joe Birch looked at her. He looked at Pete. Pete said, "Canyon east of the dry creek. Go." They went. She sent the other two, Frank Mears and a quiet young man named Avery Dodd, who did whatever the person nearest to him did, to bring in the horses from the near corral and pack the bunkhouse stovepipe with extra clay seal. She showed Avery how. He was 21 and had never done it before. He was fast and did not ask twice. She herself went back to the kitchen. She added 4 logs to the stove, not 2, 4. She moved the water barrels from the cold side of the kitchen to the warm side, which would matter in about 6 hours. She pulled every quilt from every room on the main floor and stacked them in the hallway, which would be the warmest passage once the outer walls started losing the fight with the temperature. She found Thomas Alderman's emergency whiskey. She had found it months ago and had said nothing, which was the kind of restraint that costs something and costs it quietly, and she put it on the kitchen shelf where it would be needed without anyone having to search for it. She boiled a pot of beans. She made 4 dozen biscuits. She started a second pot of coffee and did not stop the first one. Pete Hallett came in at dusk, his 7-fingered hands white at the knuckles from the cold already, and he looked at the kitchen, the quilts in the hall, the water barrels moved, the food on the stove, and he stood there for a moment. He said, "You've done this before," she said. "Texas, 79. Indian Territory, 81. Wyoming, 78. He looked at her. She handed him a cup of coffee. He sat down at the kitchen table. He did not get up from that table for the next 11 hours, not because he was tired. Because that table was where Nora Greer was, and Pete Hallett had been alive long enough to know that you stayed near the person who knew what they were doing. The Montednabs. Month Tunkyoen. Not gradually. Montana blizzards do not do things gradually. One moment the snow was heavy and the wind was what it had been, and then the wind changed direction, which is not a small thing, which is the thing, and the temperature dropped 8 more degrees in 20 minutes, and the snow became something else entirely. Something horizontal. Something that made the windows white on the inside from the cold seeping through the glass and leaving frost where it touched. The 5 men were in the main house by then. Frank Mears had not argued about this. He had looked at the bunkhouse windows and made his own calculation. Nora fed them at 8, beans and biscuits and the dried beef she had been rationing since November but was no longer rationing tonight. She did not explain the change in the rationing. Nobody asked. Frank Mears ate 3 servings, he said. "You knew this was coming this morning." Nora said, "This afternoon. The horses told me." Frank said, "Horses." Nora said, "They turned their backs to the north at 3 o'clock, all of them, at the same time. When that happens in January in Montana, you move things." Frank looked at his biscuit. He did not say anything else. Avery Dodd, who was sitting near the stove with his hands wrapped around his cup, said quietly, mostly to himself, "I didn't know that." Nora said, "Now you do." At 9, the stovepipe in the kitchen rattled, not from the wind, from a pressure drop that Nora recognized and the others did not. She added 2 more logs and checked the pipe seal and added a 3rd log, and then she checked the window seals on the north side of the house and found one that was letting cold in at the lower left corner, and she packed it with a strip of cloth from her apron pocket and did not mention it. Pete watched her do this from his chair. He said nothing. There are men in this world who are made uncomfortable by competence in a direction they did not expect it. Pete Hallett was not one of those men. He had lived too long and seen too many people die from not listening to the right person at the right time. He picked up his coffee. He was comfortable. At 10:30, Calvin Pratt said the cattle were settled in the canyon east of the dry creek and the wind hadn't touched them. Joe Birch said, She was right about the canyon. Nobody looked at Nora when he said it, which is how you know they were all thinking it. Dopshit. He came in through the kitchen door in a state that a man gets into when he has been riding through a Montana blizzard for 3 hours because he had no other option and knew it. His coat was so thick with ice that it stood on its own when he set it on the hook. His hands were wrong. His face was wrong. He was not in danger. He had made it, but he was the kind of cold that takes 2 hours to leave properly. Nora had a cup of hot coffee on the table before he sat down. She had the whiskey open beside it. She did not say, "I told you this was coming." She did not say, "The cattle are in the canyon east of the dry creek where it's 3 degrees warmer." She did not say, "The bunkhouse would have lost 2 men tonight if they'd stayed in it." She said, "Drink the coffee first, then the whiskey, in that order." Thomas Alderman, who was 47 years old and had run this ranch for 14 years and had never in those years been given an instruction in his own kitchen, looked at her. He drank the coffee, he drank the whiskey. He sat at the table while the cold worked its way out of him. At some point, Pete told him about the cattle, about the canyon, about the bunkhouse, about the window seal. Thomas listened. He looked at his coffee cup. He said, "She knew." Pete said, "Since this afternoon." Thomas said, "She didn't say anything to me." Pete said, "You weren't here." Thomas said, "She's the cook." Pete said, "Among other things." Thomas looked at Pete. Pete looked at his coffee. Outside, the blizzard was doing what it was going to do all night, which was everything. Inside, the kitchen was warm. The beans were hot. The biscuits were on the table. 5 men and 1 woman and 14 years of a ranch that was still standing because the right person had stood at a window that afternoon and seen the snow come sideways and known what it meant and moved. Wingstool for skod, bamtamtis tauskish. It left behind 31 inches of snow and a temperature of -22 and a silence so complete that the first sound anyone heard when they opened the kitchen door was a single crow somewhere to the east, which meant the worst was over. The cattle were fine, all 160 head. In the canyon east of the dry creek, sheltered by the cliff face, with access to the small seep spring that ran even in hard cold. Not one lost. In an ordinary blizzard year, the Alderman ranch might lose 8 to 12 head. Some ranchers in Meagher County had lost a quarter of their herd that night. Thomas Alderman stood at the canyon fence and looked at his cattle for a long time. He came back to the house. He came to the kitchen. Nora was making breakfast. Eggs and salt pork and the last of the biscuits from the night before, warmed on the stovetop. The kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the particular warm animal smell that the men had brought in with them from the barn. Thomas stood in the doorway. He said, "The canyon." Nora said, "The cliff face blocks the north wind. The spring keeps the floor temperature up. The animals would have found it themselves eventually, but not fast enough." Thomas said, "How did you know about the canyon?" Nora said, "I walked the property in April, when I first came." Thomas said, "Why?" Nora turned from the stove. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who has been asked a question she has answered 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways and has not been heard. She said, "Because I was going to be here through the winter, and I wanted to know what I was dealing with." Thomas said nothing. She turned back to the stove. She said, without turning around, "The South Draw floods in April. The fence on the North Ridge has 3 sections that won't hold a hard spring. The creek runs about 6 weeks longer than you're planning for on your grazing calendar. The near corral's east post is going to need setting before the ground softens." Thomas stood in the doorway. He said, "You've been here 9 months." She said, "I know." He said, "You know my property better than 2 of my hired men." She said, "3 of them." He did not respond to that, not immediately. He stood in the doorway of his kitchen while the eggs cooked and the coffee ran, and the ranch he had built over 14 years was, this morning, intact, because a woman he had been paying to make biscuits had walked his land in April and filed everything she found. He said, "What else?" Nora turned around. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Sit down." He sat down, she told him. It took 40 minutes. She talked about the South Draw, which was going to be a problem every spring thaw if he kept running the herd through it. She talked about the creek schedule and the grazing rotation that would account for it. She talked about the North Ridge fence and the specific posts that were frost-heaved, and which ones could be reset versus replaced. She talked about the east pasture drainage problem she had identified in October, and the simple fix that would prevent it becoming a $200 problem in May. She did not use notes. She said all of this the way she did everything, without preamble, without seeking agreement, the way you say things when you have had them ready for 9 months and have been waiting for the right question. Thomas Alderman listened. He was a man who did not write things down while listening. He remembered them. This was useful, because there was a great deal to remember. When she was done, there was a silence. The eggs had gone cold. He had not noticed. He said, "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" She said, "You didn't ask." He said, "You should have said something." She said, "I'm the cook." He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, "That's what I hired you as." She said, "Yes." He said, "It's not what you are." She said, "No." He picked up his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. He said, "I have a foreman position. It's been empty since Jake Holt left in September." She said, "I know. I've been doing half of it." He looked at her. She said, "The other half Pete's been doing. He won't say so." Thomas said, "Pete's 71. She said, "He's also the only person on this property who knew what I knew and didn't need convincing." Thomas set down the cup. He said, "I'd need to pay you differently." She said, "Yes." He said, "The men." She said, "Frank Mears will take 3 days and then he'll be fine. Joe and Calvin won't have a problem. Avery Dodd will do whatever he's told by whoever tells him clearly." He said, "You've thought about this." She said, "I've been here 9 months." He looked at his cold eggs. He said, "There's another thing." She waited. He said it looking at the table, not at her. The way men say things they have been carrying when they have finally found someone they think can hold the weight. He said, "It's a hard life, this valley, these winters. I'm not." He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I'm not easy to be around when it gets hard." She said, "I know. I've been watching." He looked up. She said, "You get quiet. You go to the north fence and work the line alone. You don't ask for help because you think asking means something is wrong with you." A pause. "It doesn't. It means you're tired." He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "How long have you known that?" She said, "April." Outside, the snow lay 31 inches deep across the Boulder Creek Valley, and the temperature was 22 below, and the cattle were in the canyon east of the dry creek, exactly where they were supposed to be. He said, "I'm asking you to stay, not as the cook." She said, "I know what you're asking." He said, "Is that a yes?" She looked at him with the expression she had when she looked at the flour canister the night before. Counting, making the numbers come out right. She said, "Ask me when the spring comes and the south draw floods and the north fence needs work, and you've seen what I'm actually like when I'm not managing a crisis." He said, "I know what you're like." She said, "You know what I'm like in 9 months and 1 blizzard." He said, "That's enough." She said, "Ask me in April." He asked her in April. She said yes. Moist. The south draw flooded in April, as she had said it would, and she was at the fence line before Thomas was, with a plan for redirecting the runoff that would prevent it from undercutting the east pasture bank. He looked at the plan. He approved it. He handed it to Calvin Pratt, who built it in 3 days. The north fence was reset in May. She was right about which posts could be saved and which ones were gone. She was right about everything on that property, which Thomas Alderman already knew, but which the spring confirmed in the methodical, specific, undeniable way that spring confirms things in Montana. He asked her in April. She said yes. They were married in June in the Boulder Creek Church, which had stood since 1880 and which had held the weddings and funerals of everyone in the valley, and which was, on this particular Saturday, full. Not because Thomas Alderman was a popular man. He was a respected one, which is different, but because Nora Greer had become, over 9 months and 1 blizzard, something the valley did not have a name for yet but recognized immediately, the person who knew. Pete Hallett stood at the back with his 7-fingered hands and cried a little, which was new for Pete Hallett, and which he later said was on account of a speck of dust. Frank Mears, who had been converted not by argument, but by the simple passage of time and the growing evidence of his own experience, shook Thomas's hand after the ceremony, and then shook Nora's and said, "You were right about the canyon." Nora said, "I know." Frank said, "I should have moved faster." "Mefgend," she said, "next time you will." He nodded. That was all. Missin'. The following winter was harder than the one before. It is the way of Montana winters to teach you not to be proud of having survived the last one. The Alderman Ranch lost 3 head. Every other spread in the Boulder Creek Valley that ran more than 100 head lost between 8 and 20. The Alderman cattle were in the canyon east of the dry creek, as they had been the year before. The timing was better this time. The preparation was better. The protocol. Nora had written out a protocol, 1 page, which she nailed to the bunkhouse door and which Pete referred to as the Bible, not unkindly, was followed. Frank Mears watched the horses at 2 o'clock on the afternoon of January the 14th and came inside and told Nora. She was already at the window. She said, "I know." He said, "What do you need?" She told him. He went. This is how it works, when it works. Not because anyone declared it, not because a meeting was called or a title was conferred or a conversation was had about who was in charge. Because a woman knew what she knew and had the patience to wait for the people around her to stop being surprised by it. There is a kind of competence that doesn't announce itself, that walks a property in April and files everything it finds, that counts the flour and moves the water barrels and packs the window seals without being asked, that understands that being underestimated is a temporary condition if you simply keep doing the work. Nora Greer had known this for a long time. The blizzard had just helped everyone else figure it out. Not I, Chuo. I think about Nora Greer sometimes. Not the blizzard night, the morning after it. When she turned from the stove and looked at Thomas Alderman and said what she'd been holding since April, she had known all of it, for 9 months, and she had kept it ready, in that particular way that capable people keep things, not resentfully, not strategically, just ready for when the question was finally asked. There are people in every life who know more than they're given credit for, who have been watching and walking and filing everything away and waiting for someone to notice, or for a blizzard to make the noticing unavoidable. I think most of us have been Nora at some point, knowing what we know, waiting for the room to be ready to hear it. And I think some of us have been Thomas, standing in the kitchen doorway, finally asking. If you're the one who hasn't asked yet, ask. The eggs are cold, but the coffee's still warm, and the person across the table knows more than you think. Take care of yourselves out there. Until next time.